There's something on the camera here.
What?
On the YouTube that I'm looking at. Take a look at that.
So it should be on YouTube now, and then you can like.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Yiddish Summer Weimar's special lecture series, which is called The World of Kisselhoff and Makonovetsky, which is connected to our special subject this year on the Kisselhoff-Makonovetsky digital manuscript project. And we're very, very honored to have with us today as a guest one of the most eminent scholars in the field of folklore and ethnography and Jewish studies in the world. And before I turn it over to Barbara Kirshenblatt-Gimblett, I would like to also say that I'm grateful to Craig Udelman for providing the inspiration and also being project manager of this series. So without further ado, I welcome you to Barbara Kirshenblatt.
Well, thank you very, very much, Alan. I for many, many years, probably, well, I like to think of myself as your greatest fan. And we've tried repeatedly to arrange for me to speak at Weimar. And I wish I could actually be there in person, but hopefully, once it is safe to travel, I will be able to join you. I see that the recording is paused, and I'm assuming that you do want to record this session. Very good, thank you. So let me dive right in. And first of all, I do hope that there will be questions and comments, and I would kindly ask you to put them in the chat, and we'll allow time afterwards for them. And what I'm going to do today, as I bring up my screen, okay, just a moment here. Okay. So I was asked to talk about Jewish life in Eastern Europe and to provide a kind of historical framework for the topic that is your focus this year at Weimar. And because my field is Polish Jews, which actually is broader than what it sounds like, because when we think of the historic territory of Poland, we think of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which existed between 1569 and 1795, and it encompassed territory that is today Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, Belarus, and neighboring areas. So it is the larger, wider territory of the collection that you are focused on. And it seemed to me that the way in which we present, interpret, narrate the history of Polish Jews across a millennium was as good a way as any to provide a framework for your work, and particularly because it's a very vivid way in an hour to convey that wider history. And so I want to start with a quotation, and it's a quotation that comes from when Arnie Eisen, the chancellor, the past chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, attended the opening of Pauline Museum of the History of Polish Jews in October 2014. And this is what he said: "It's not often that a museum makes history as well as chronicles it, and rare too when otherwise cautious observers remark at the opening of a new museum that it may prove a source of hope and pride that propels an entire society forward." Both of those things happened this week in Warsaw with the opening of Pauline Museum. And what I want to really stress is the role of the museum in taking the best scholarship and communicating it in a very, very vivid way to a wide general audience. And I think that that is a very, very important part of our mission. And so with that, let me now take you to Pauline Museum. So where are we? We are located on the rubble of the Warsaw Ghetto and the pre-war Jewish neighborhood. And if you'll just give me a moment, just give me a moment. We are located on the rubble of the Warsaw Ghetto and the pre-war Jewish neighborhood. This is what the area looked like after the Germans destroyed the Warsaw Ghetto. They suppressed the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and they leveled the entire area. And literally, they left an ocean of rubble. And it took many decades after the end of World War II to actually rebuild the area. And the area, the very first thing that those who survived the Holocaust and who came back to Warsaw, the very first thing they did was to mount a memorial to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and they unveiled it on the 5th anniversary of the uprising. The uprising was in April and May of 1943, and the 5th anniversary was 1948. So you can see that the rubble is still there. They have to climb up it to do the unveiling. And in the background, you can see the destroyed city of Warsaw, because after the Germans suppressed the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, they suppressed the Warsaw Uprising a year later, and they destroyed 85% of the historical core of the city. So this is the context, and this is the location where we have created a museum dedicated to the history of Polish Jews. And as you can see here, and this is the monument, that today the area is completely cleared of rubble, of course, and it's surrounded by communist era apartment blocks. And the monument has two sides. On one side, it shows the ghetto heroes, the fighters, and on the other side, it shows the Great Deportation. Now, the museum was conceived in 1993, but it wasn't founded until 2005. And it didn't have its grand opening until 2014. But it was always understood as completing the memorial complex, that we would go to the monument to honor those who died by remembering how they died, and that we would come to the museum to honor their memory by remembering how they lived, and how they lived for 1,000 years, because this history had been so overshadowed by the Holocaust. And so the museum completes the memorial complex. We go to the monument to remember how they died. We go to the museum to remember how they lived. And that is our task. And as I indicated, on the other side of the monument is a commemoration of the Great Deportation of 300,000 Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto to the death camp in Treblinka. The museum is called Pauline Museum, and it is the word itself. Pauline is, of course, Poland in Hebrew and Poil in Yiddish, and we take that name very much from the inspiration of a legend that I will tell you about in just a moment. But as you can see, it's a beautiful glass building which really communicates light, transparency, openness, reflection. And this is the other side of the building. It's the largest glass window in any building in Poland. And the building itself is very discreet and minimalist and transparent from the outside, and very dramatic on the inside, with this very beautiful and very complicated piece of engineering, and very, very responsive to light. So just to give you a sense of the contrast between the minimalist exterior and the sort of voluptuous organic interior. Now, taking the rubble not only as a literal fact, but also as a metaphor, this is a museum that was built without any historical fabric, no historical buildings, no historical neighborhood, and also it began without a collection, although it has formed a collection since its founding. And so its greatest single asset was the story it wanted to tell, which was the 1,000-year history of Polish Jews, and to do so in the most vivid way possible. And so when we worked with the architect, in a sense, the architect had the freedom to create a fabulous building, and then he gave us the footprint of the building below ground to create the exhibition, which gave us enormous flexibility. We could do whatever we wanted. Now, given that we did not have we didn't have a collection, but even what we did have or what we could have borrowed from anywhere could not have supported the 1,000-year story. And I'll show you some of the reasons why and the ways in which we address this particular issue. And so instead of starting from a collection, which is what other museums generally do, we started from the story. And we created a multimedia narrative exhibition, what I like to think of as a theater of history. And this particular image, which I will come back to, it opens the 19th century gallery, is a beautiful example of that kind of what I'd call scenographic theater, or the theater of mise en scène, or still life theater. In other words, we think of the experience that we wanted our visitors to have as one in which they would find themselves inside the story, and in a sense, on the stage, and that they would activate the story literally by walking the plot. And that's what we're going to, essentially what we're going to do. Now, it's not as if there aren't objects, there are. And the most important collection in Poland is at the Jewish Historical Institute. But it, like many other collections in the world, most other collections in the world, consists almost entirely of 19th and 20th century materials. So paintings, drawings, prints, photographs, medals, memorabilia, photographs, and ceremonial art, Judaica. And virtually, in the case of the Jewish Historical Institute and most other places, nothing from the medieval period, where there's very little anyway, and very little, if anything, from the centuries that followed. So clearly, if we were going to tell a compelling story, we weren't going to be able to do it that way. So this is a very special museum in contemporary Poland, and I think some of you may be interested in actually discussing the situation there today and the place of the museum, its role and the challenges that it faces. But first of all, what's important is that it was established, it was founded, it was initiated by a Jewish NGO in Poland, the Association of the Jewish Historical Institute of Poland. And in 2005, they formed a partnership, a unique public-private partnership with the Ministry of Culture in the city of Warsaw. And as of 2021, we've had about 4 million visitors, and we won the biggest prize in Europe, the European Museum of the Year Award in 2016. Now, I think that one of the advantages we had of our disadvantage of no funding or very little funding for extended periods of time is that it gave us time with our academic advisors. And in fact, there were more than advisors, they were active creators of the exhibition, and with our curators and with our designers, to really give a lot of thought to the nature of this history and how we wanted to present it. And these are the real takeaways, that we would hope that when a visitor left the exhibition, when they had encountered this 1,000-year history of Polish Jews, that these would be some of the key messages that they would take away, because these are some of the, what we call meta-historical principles that we used in constructing the narrative. So first of all, we're often asked, what is the most important period in the history of Polish Jews? And usually whoever is asking already knows the answer, and the answer usually is the Holocaust. And we say, no, not the Holocaust, not the post-war years, not the interwar years, that the single most important period in the history of Polish Jews is 1,000 years, a millennium, all of it. And that no one period is any, quote, more important than any other period, that the big message is that Jews were living in this territory continuously and without interruption until the Holocaust. And that is a millennium of continuous Jewish presence in a place that became home to the largest Jewish community in the world. During the 18th century, half the Jews in the world lived in the territory of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. I'll be showing you a map of that in just a moment. And that's 750,000 Jews. And so there's a very, very big message there. And I would say it's our top message. That's number one. Number two, that Jews are an integral part of the history of Poland, that they're not only in Poland, but also of Poland. And this is really important because I think it too works against certain preconceptions about the nature of Polish Jewish history. The third is that we present a spectrum of relations, that this is not a history of Polish Jewish relations, a history of anti-Semitism. It is rather a story of a spectrum of relations without which we wouldn't have the music that you're studying and playing. It's a story of coexistence and conflict, cooperation and competition, separation and integration. And then, and this is a formulation, and many of these principles we really take from Moshe Rossman, a wonderful historian of the early modern period of Polish Jewish history, that Polish Jews created a civilization that is categorically Jewish, distinctly Polish. And this would be a very interesting way to think about music. In fact, I think many of these principles are perfect for thinking about the music that you are studying and playing. Polish Jews became the largest Jewish community in the world and a center of the Jewish world. There is power to tell the story in the place where it happened, as opposed to what many of I would say that many of the people that I've spoken with said, why don't you make it in New York or Tel Aviv? Well, it would never have the power that it has by telling it in Poland, and particularly on the site of the Warsaw Ghetto and the pre-war Jewish neighborhood. And we are a site of conscience for creating a trusted zone, or a zone of trust for engaging difficult subjects. Because as a museum, we have a mission to engage our public in difficult topics and to engage them as citizens as responsible citizens, and as people who have a collective responsibility to address history and their knowledge of that history in contemporary Poland and in the world today. So now let me take you into the exhibition, and this will be a kind of a double narrative. It's going to be the history of Polish Jews, which is, I think, what the invitation to me requested, but it's going to be as we present it at Pauline Museum of the History of Polish Jews. And so we begin with what we think of as a priming experience to put our visitors in the mood and to, in a sense, separate them from their everyday world of the bus, the parking lot, the cloakroom, the tickets, and to, in a sense, prepare them for basically a 1,000-year journey in the course of 2 or 3 hours, where we hope they'll forget about everything else and just simply become very absorbed and very immersed in this story. So we begin with a forest, and we begin with a legend beautifully retold by Shin Agnon, the Nobel laureate, Israeli Hebrew writer and Nobel laureate. And the story goes something like this, and this is essentially a legend, and it's a story that Jews told themselves about why they came to Poland, where they came from, and why they stayed. And what's so beautiful about it is that it is a legend, and in a sense, those who tell the legend are asking themselves the same questions our visitors are asking, which is, where did these Jews come from and why did they come to Poland? So the legend goes something like this. Jews are being persecuted in Western Europe. They fled east. They came to a forest. And when they came to the forest, they heard birds chirping, or the clouds broke and an angel's hand and finger pointed, or they saw words inscribed on a tree or pages of the Gemara floating down. And what they thought they heard, it is after all a legend, is Pauline. And they thought they were hearing Hebrew. It's a folk etymology. It's a legend, which they thought meant rest here, or here you shall dwell. And they said to themselves, it is divinely ordained that we come here and that we stay here, and we will stay here until the prophet Elijah comes and blows his shofar to announce the coming of the Messiah and to take us to the land of Israel. So that is an extraordinary way to begin a 1,000-year history of Polish Jews. It is, on the one hand, it signals, if you will, violence and anti-Jewish, anti-Judaism, however you want to characterize the situation in Western Europe. But it also communicates that those who told this legend felt that they belonged here, and that they belonged here for a very, very, very long time. And I think that that is a very important message, of course, together with the more difficult and darker aspects of this story. So once we leave the forest and we enter the medieval gallery, we cross the threshold between legend and history. Now, the medieval gallery actually extends from, I think, 964 to 1505. That is more than 500 years. And that is more than half of the millennium. More than half of the millennium is the medieval period. In other words, it's the longue durée, very, very long period of time, and a very, very slow period of time. Nothing like the 20th century where everything seems to have speeded up. So what happened in that 500 years, and what do we present? In that 500 years, we begin with traveling Jewish merchants who are moving along trade routes from Western Europe and from, say, Spain and Portugal, Germany and France and Italy, and they're moving across Europe. They're moving along trade routes through Poland. They're moving all the way into Byzantium, and they're carrying goods with them, and they're bringing spices and other goods back. And those traveling Jewish merchants, they wrote letters, and some of them were themselves very learned, may have been rabbis, diplomats, doctors, geographers. They sent reports, they wrote travel accounts, they sent letters back to rabbis in the Rhineland, asking questions about what were Jews doing in the Wild East. And so that's how we know what was going on. I mean, we have some other sources, but for the very, very early period, we start with those traveling merchants. And what we want to try to understand is how, from a few traveling merchants, starting in the 10th century, do we arrive at the 16th century and we have Jews living in more than 100 locations with Jewish communities, full Jewish communities in about 50 of them. So that's the story we want to tell in the medieval gallery. But what can we tell the story with? We only have two kinds of original objects that were made by, well, certainly made by Jews, and that are Polish Jewish objects. Two tombstones. The one on the left is, in fact, the oldest Jewish tombstone from Poland, 1203 in Wrocław, which was Breslau before the war, and coins, which are the size of a dime, that have Hebrew inscriptions on them, which indicate that there were Jewish minters or Jews who were supervising minting. And the inscriptions on them will say things like bracha v'hatzlacha, in other words, blessing and success. They'll have the name of the king on it, Mieszko. They might have the name of the minter on it. They'll have some kind of an image on it. And we show an original coin. We actually own and show an original coin. But that's it for the medieval period. So how do you tell that 500-year story when you only got those two objects? So the first thing is we started with those sources, those travel accounts, chronicles, legal documents, and the very, very important, the correspondence, the letters that were sent and the answers that were written by rabbis in the Rhineland, because the Rhineland was the center of Ashkenazi Jewish culture during the medieval period. And of course, that will change. By the end of the period, that center has moved to Poland. But during the medieval period, that's where rabbinical authority was, and those are the sources that we use. Now, there are wonderful illuminated manuscripts from the Rhineland, Hebrew manuscripts from the medieval period. And so we took those stories and we took those manuscripts and we went to Poland's most popular comic book artists, and we said to them, we want you to illustrate these stories in the style of the period, using these illuminated manuscripts as an inspiration and with the stories that we've given you. And we then hired the individuals that are specialists in the conservation and restoration of historic churches in Poland, and we asked them to hand paint these images that illustrate these stories on the walls directly. And we had a man that specializes in gilding with real gold leaf to gild the area on the other wall that deals with the relationship of Jews and the court, Jews and the king. And the outcome is this extraordinary hand-painted gallery, which is like a 100, it's like a life-scale illuminated manuscript in 360 degrees. And then, of course, we have multimedia interactive components as a way of deepening the story. But just to give you a sense of what do you do, I mean, I would say that necessity is the mother of invention. What do you do when you've got a big, long, rich, interesting story and virtually no, I mean, to all intents and purposes, no original objects, but an important story to tell, and you have other sources. And so that's what we did. Now, when we leave the medieval gallery, we enter the period of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And you can see on the right, I don't know if I can, whether my cursor can show it to you, but I'll show you this map in a moment. That is a map of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. What happened was that during the medieval period, Poland absorbed Ukraine and became much, much bigger. But during the Commonwealth period, 1569 to 1795, the Poland and Lithuania joined together to form a Commonwealth so as to be stronger in fending off invasion from its neighbors. So from the Austrian Empire, the Russian Empire, from Prussia. So it formed, in fact, this Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was, in fact, one of the largest countries in Europe, and certainly one of the most diverse in terms of religion, language, culture, region. It was really, and very, very strong, certainly in the first half, very strong. It was an economic power. It was an economic powerhouse. It was the breadbasket. Ukraine was the breadbasket of Europe. So that big, huge territory is in many ways the territory of the music that you're working with. And we'll say more about that in just a moment. So the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, this big, strong, diverse country, which was became home to the largest Jewish community in the world, the 750,000 Jews, half the Jewish population by the 18th century, is really the period when the center of Ashkenazi Jewish culture and rabbinical authority shift to here from the Rhineland. And families in the Rhineland are sending their sons to yeshivas in this territory. And so we tell this story in two parts. We tell this, in a sense, the shift of rabbinical authority and the rise of Jewish communal autonomy, unprecedented between the period of the temple and the state of Israel, that Jewish communities in this territory had an extraordinary degree of communal autonomy and were able to govern so many aspects of their own lives. So we tell that story here. And of course, it's not easy to tell it. And we have a strategy in the way that we present the entire history of Polish Jews at Pauline Museum, and that is we like to tell it in many voices. We try to avoid what we think of as an anonymous voiceover narrator. We try to avoid a kind of master narrative or a single thread. And so this gives you a feel for the, I would call it the play script for our theater of history, which are quotations from primary documents from the period. And this would be a wonderful example of just that. Now, here's the map. And it turns out that no matter how many bells and whistles and how many, videos and touch screens and whatever else there might be, in fact, sometimes the simplest graphic presentation is the most memorable. And virtually everybody who comes to this map always looks for where is their hometown. And they take a cell phone photograph with their mobile phone. They take a photograph of their hometown on this map. But here you can see, this is in the medieval period, this was Poland. Poland absorbed Ukraine, then Lithuania joined. And here you can see the Russian Empire, the Kingdom of Prussia, and the Austrian Empire. So you get a sense of the geography. And this is really just an enormous and very powerful country. Now, how do we express this idea? These are very abstract ideas. Poland, or this territory, the Commonwealth, becomes a center of rabbinical authority. That's an abstract idea. How do you present it? Or the communities, Jewish communities here had a high degree of Jewish self-government. How do you present that? Well, one of the ways in which it was expressed in the period was through Hebrew and Yiddish printing. And so this area became extremely important and a center of Hebrew and Yiddish printing that moved essentially from Italy to Prague to Krakow and Lublin. And we thought we could make this really vivid, especially for kids, by creating printing presses, which it turns out adults love also. And they're real presses that you literally put the paper in, push the paper under the ink pad, press it, and then you can actually print the title page of a 16th century book of the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, for example, or the Jewish printer's marks. but you can also, quote, open those books through digital presentations of their contents and through the interpretation and translation of them, which I think is a very unique opportunity. Now, in the middle of this period of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1646, 7, 8, there was the Malnitsky Uprising, which was a devastating event. It was, in fact, a century of war, and there was the Swedish Wars, which devastated the Commonwealth. But the Malnitsky Uprising is really remembered as the worst catastrophe between the destruction of the temple and the Holocaust, and it is enshrined even in the liturgy to this day. And so we present this catastrophic event where a third of the Jewish population was either murdered or forced to leave or converted, or but basically it was hugely disruptive. But we present it as a caesura rather than as a turning point in the history of Polish Jews, and we have extraordinary firsthand witness accounts that were written during and just after these events. So the material for communicating exactly what happened is extraordinary. And essentially, this was led by Khmelnytsky and Cossacks, and it essentially leveraged the dissatisfaction and the misery of Ukrainian peasants who saw the Catholic Church, Polish nobility, and the Jews as the source of their misery. And so that was the kind of, I would say, powder keg that exploded. But by the end of the 17th century, the Commonwealth had rebounded. It had been, a very strong economy, especially exporting grain, shipping it up the Vistula on rafts, and then up to Gdańsk, to Danzig, and then sending it on ships to Western Europe. So the Commonwealth rebounded at the end of the 17th century, and the nobility wanted to reestablish their towns, reestablish the economy of their towns, and invited Jews to come back. In some cases, gave them a loan to rebuild their synagogue. And they really depended, because Jews had functioned throughout this period as managers of the noble estates. They were managing fisheries and taverns and forests and mills and whole villages. So they were really instrumental in the entire economy. And they lived in towns, in market towns, where they played a very, very important function as well. And so what we do is, when we come out of what we call the corridor of fire, we zoom in on everyday life and the most characteristic form of Jewish settlement. And the most characteristic form of Jewish settlement is urban. That means either the city or the town, and towns above all. And in this period, basically, in these towns, I would say, if I took my father's town, for example, my father is from the town of Opatów, Opt in Yiddish, in what is south central Poland today, not far from Krakow. And his town in the 1930s had 10,000 inhabitants, of which 6,500 were Jews, 6,500 were Jews. And that was typical. So, in the interwar years, a third of the population of Warsaw was Jewish, a quarter in Krakow, a third in Lodz, between 50 and 70% in Białystok. So they're really, in other words, even if Jews formed maybe a little bit less than 10% of the population, where they settled, they could form 50, 60, 70, 80, even 90% of the population, which made them what we call Jewish towns. And they had a very, I think, from that sheer concentration of Jews in these towns, the towns themselves acquired a very particular character, and Jewish life itself developed a very distinctive character as well, a very integral Jewish way of life, with a lot of interaction between Jews and non-Jews, especially in the marketplace and in what surrounded the marketplace, as, of course, economically above all. And in this period, the Western Europe had rebounded as well and didn't need the volume of grain that had been exported from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth before the Khmelnytsky Uprising, before the century of war. And now the Commonwealth was saddled with a glut of grain. And what are they going to do with the grain? How much grain can the Commonwealth actually absorb? In fact, it can't absorb it as bread. It can't absorb it as flour. How can it absorb it? Alcohol. And so grain converted into alcohol became the major way in which this glut of grain could be consumed. And Jews were given an almost monopoly on the production, distribution, and sale of alcohol, and the running of taverns and inns, which were the primary meeting places. And they were also a place of gathering news and socializing for the local peasantry. And so that when we present this Jewish town, we present a number of areas. We present the tavern, the home, church. We're probably the only museum that presents Jewish history that includes, quote, a church. And the tavern, of course, is a place for music. And we know it also from the wonderful poem by Adam Mickiewicz, the Pantadeusz, and the story of Yankel, the legendary, iconic cymbal player. So the tavern would be a very interesting site to focus on, and it was a very much a place of, well, where Jews were running them, and where there was, of course, interaction with a largely non-Jewish, basically peasant and Polish public. So moving around the marketplace, we look at women's piety, and particularly in the context of the home, the changing relationship of Jews and the church, a really fascinating story, the rise of false messiahs like Jacob Frank, for example, which is another whole story, the popularization of the Kabbalah, of the Jewish mystical tradition, and of course, the other center of gravity. The two centers of gravity in these Jewish towns were, on the one hand, the marketplace and all that surrounded it, and the synagogue and all that surrounded it. And Jews were not living, in a kind of segregated area. If you're 65% of the town is Jewish, yes, there are areas that are very concentrated, but Jews are also living around the marketplace as well as on the so-called Jewish street, and in the areas around the synagogue and other communal buildings, the Beis Medrash, the mikveh, and other communal buildings. Now, we knew that we always wanted to represent one of the great achievements in terms of Jewish visual culture, which is the wooden synagogue. And these wooden synagogues, there were over 200 of them that were created and that were still standing by the 19th century, when the documentation of them really got underway during the late 19th century. And they are incredible works of architectural engineering and architectural art. And so we were very, very eager to include some aspect of a wooden synagogue for the 18th century in this Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth gallery, but particularly in the second half, because they were very characteristic in these Jewish towns. However, first of all, they were wood, so a certain number of them just simply burned down, especially during World War I. And then during World War II, the Germans burnt the rest of them down to the ground. And none of these great 16th, 17th, 18th century wooden synagogues, the golden age, the heyday of these incredible synagogues, none of them were left standing. However, because of the emergence of an interest in Jewish vernacular architecture, which is linked to the emergence of interest in Jewish folk music, folklore, ethnography, material culture, Ansky's ethnographic expedition, Beregovsky's work, all of that is all of a piece. And that emerges in the late 19th century, and then it continues during the 1920s and 30s. And as a result of that interest, and this is part of a more general interest in the region's vernacular wooden architecture and in the region's folklore and folk culture. So the Jewish piece of it is, I would say, part of a more general appreciation of folk creativity. So because the architects for these wonderful buildings were not trained in any school, they basically transmitted their architectural knowledge through their sort of embodied knowledge, through apprenticeship, through oral tradition, through example. So one of the wooden synagogues, the one that was best documented, is the one that once stood in Gvozdets, which is today in Ukraine. And we have the most extraordinary documentation for it. Just really extraordinary. From the 1890s, from the few years before World War I, when, as we understand, the Russian front moved through Gvozdyets and the synagogue burned down. But the documentation is hundreds of architectural drawings and measurements, and there's some color studies and photographs, and also even a painting by Isidor Kaufmann that he made in the late 1890s. He was a Jewish painter in Vienna who loved to go into the sort of, the sort of, I would say, the wilds of Galicia, and to visit these wooden synagogues and to paint them. He treated this area as his paradise. He wrote these enthusiastic letters home about how incredible it was to see this Jewish way of life, compared with Vienna, which was so very acculturated. And so this, in fact, is for us a very important color reference, because it is part of the interior of the Gvozdyets wooden synagogue. So without, even if the synagogue still existed, and Gvozdyets was a tiny town, it had less than 2,000 people in it. It was a really tiny town, and it was a very small synagogue. Even if it had existed, even if we could have moved it, as the Israel Museum has done with synagogues from Italy, even if we could have moved it, we wouldn't have brought the entire synagogue into the museum. In any event, that wasn't an option. But what was an option was to do something that Hans House Studio, a wonderful educational nonprofit in Massachusetts, does, which is to recover a lost object. And what they say is you cannot recover the original object in the sense of the original material, but you can recover the knowledge of how to make it by building it with traditional tools, materials, and techniques. And that's what we did. So we went to an open air folk architecture museum, a skansen, in the south of Poland, outside of Synagogue. And they were kind enough to give us a plot of land to work on. And we ordered 200 raw logs with the bark still on. And then we brought together a team of experts and volunteers. This is the Timber Framers Guild of America, plus other timber framers in Europe that love to work with traditional tools. And they brought them in ski bags and in golf bags, and they brought adzes and lathes and pit saws and axes and whatever is necessary, like Lord of the Rings. And they engaged students who had never even picked up a hammer to actually do the timber framing for the ceiling and roof of the Gvozdyet synagogue. And then we took the structure apart, because it's put together with wooden pegs, and we stored it. And then we brought the parts to Poland in an enormous truck, and we lowered it into the exhibition level, and we reassembled it, and we hoisted this 25-ton structure, and we suspended it from the roof. We then proceeded to do the same kind of workshop using traditional tools, materials, and techniques to actually paint the synagogue ceiling in a series of workshops in existing standing masonry synagogues in Poland today, with about 20 students and a team of specialists and experts. And then we assembled it, and this is what it looks like in the museum today. And of course, it's one of the most memorable experiences, particularly for kids who walk around like little turtles with these cushions on their backs. And we think, I can well imagine that in the future, they'll come back and say, we just want 10 minutes and we want to stand under the beautiful Gvozdyet synagogue. And then you can see the timber framing of the roof, which we've left partially unshingled from the very, very top. Now, the period ends in 1895 with the third partitioning of the Commonwealth. You can see the map of the Commonwealth here, and you can see the heads of the three empires, of the Russian Empire, Austrian Empire, and the Kingdom of Prussia. And they are tearing up the map of the Commonwealth, and they are each taking a piece of the royal cake. Because at this time, Poland had become a republic of nobles. It was very decentralized. It had a very weak army. And the surrounding powers said, perfect moment. We're going to cut up the Commonwealth. We're going to each take a piece. End of the Commonwealth. Poland disappears from the face of the map. There is no Commonwealth. There is no Poland for over 120 years, between 1895 and World War I. Gone. The map is torn up. And we try to communicate that here by showing the three powers enormous to get the message across that in the story that we will tell for the long 19th century, we will be telling as a story of Jews who stayed put, but the borders changed and they are still living in the same places, but under a new regime, and that they are living in the partitions of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Russian partition, the Austrian partition, and the partition of the Kingdom of Prussia. And we want to ask ourselves, well, what happened during this long 19th century? Because it was a period of what we call encounters with modernity, attempts to reform Jewish life, both by the state and internally within the Jewish community itself, to reform Jewish dress, to reform the role of rabbis, to reform marriage age, to reform the educational system, to reform, to require military, to institute conscription, to, I would say, to reform wedding practices, to get rid of, for example, the dowry of Naden, to get rid of arranged marriage, for marriage to be based more on love. There were just an infinity of ways in which Jewish life was under, I would say, pressure to change and also resistance to change that produced a kind of, I would say, a new approach to tradition, so that you could call it a kind of modernization that had a kind of traditionalizing aspect to it, as well as a reform aspect. So it's the period, it's really an extraordinary period in which we show the emergence of the Jewish Enlightenment, the Haskalah, of the modern yeshiva, which is one of the great success stories because it continues until this day, and the rise of Hasidism. And what was interesting here for the yeshiva in particular, we had no visual material, and so we actually created a kind of visualization on the computer in the studio, but then we used live actors and we actually painted them and we filmed them in a green room, and then we basically put together the live actors and the scenography to create 24 hours in the yeshiva of Volozhin from basically dawn to dawn. And it's really one of the most, I think, one of the most memorable and extraordinary essentially responses to not having any visual material. And so the Jewish Enlightenment, the modern yeshiva, the rise and the spread of Hasidism, and then we come to the middle of the 19th century and things start to really speed up, and we basically, in a sense, speed it up by launching the second half of the 19th century with the railway station, the role of Jews in creating the railway, and the process that ensued of industrialization, urbanization, social mobility, demographic expansion, huge move from small towns to the big cities, the development of big factories, Jews working in workshops, and a real transformation of Jewish life. At the same time that many aspects of that life that we know from the earlier periods also persist. So it's a period of the emergence of modern Jewish political movements. Of course, the winners are the Bund, the Jewish labor movement, the Zionist movement, and the Aguda, the religious movement. It is the period of mass emigration, where a third of the Jewish population between 1880 and World War I actually leave, and most of them for the United States. And it is the period of the emergence of modern Hebrew and Yiddish culture. And of course, our icon for Yiddish culture is Yud Lamed Peretz. And we see this in theater and in literature and in the visual arts. But it's also the period of revolution and war and pogroms. And then finally, World War I. And with World War I, the empires collapse. Ottoman Empire collapses, the Russian Empire, the Austrian Empire, and by this time, the Kingdom of Prussia is part of Germany. And so it's only after World War I in 1918 that Poland reemerges as an independent country, as the Second Polish Republic. But this is the period where there is a redrawing of the map of Europe. And now we have Lithuania is a country, Ukraine is a country. They are, of course, part of the Soviet bloc. but Poland is not. Poland is the Second Polish Republic, and it is not part of the Soviet Union. And this period of the 1920s and 30s is a very short period, but an extraordinarily vibrant one, politically and culturally. So it is a period of, I would say, economic hardship. You can imagine after World War I, the country was destroyed. There were refugees, people were displaced, there was hunger, there was economic hardship, then there was the Depression. So it was a period of enormous stress, and also particularly in the late 30s of the worst period of anti-Semitism in Poland as well. But despite all of that, it was also a period of exceptional political vibrancy, a period of exceptional, and here we present, of course, the labor movement, the Aguda, and Zionism, exceptional cultural creativity in Yiddish, to a lesser degree in Hebrew, and also in Polish, which is something that we present. And it is a period of intergenerational conflict, so that you have, grandparents, parents, and children. And this is a period, the 20s and 30s. It's the first time, it is basically the first generation to go to Polish public schools. So that my parents, my father was born in 1916, my mother in 1915, and they both went to Polish public school. So there was, of course, the Jewish school systems. There was a Yiddish school system, Tzisho, a Hebrew school system organized by the Zionists, Tarbut. There were Jewish gymnasia, which are middle and high schools in Polish, as well as, of course, in Hebrew. And there was the religious school system, the cheters and yeshivas, and also the Bes Yankov, which was a very interesting, modern, Orthodox school for Jewish girls that emerged only in the interwar years, thanks to a visionary, Sarah Schneerer. And so we present that sort of generational, if you will, the new generation that emerges in the 20s and 30s, and their world, their autonomous world of play, the world of school. And here I was able to actually present my father's memories of his own childhood and the toys that he used to make out of nothing, out of newspaper, string, buttons, tin, rubber, birch bark, or rather willow bark, whatever it might be. We show daily life in these so-called Jewish towns across the length and breadth of Poland. And then, and all of this is set on what we call a Jewish street, a two-level space with culture and politics on the lower level and daily life and growing up on the upper levels. And it was very important for us, and it was important all the way through the exhibition, that our visitors not foreshadow the Holocaust, that they not be walking through the exhibition waiting for the Holocaust to happen and seeing the entire history of Polish Jews through the lens of the Holocaust, as if the Holocaust were the inevitable, if you will, teleological goal of this history. It was very important for us to pull back from that. And that's why we insisted on telling this story in what I call the historical present and in the first person. So when you're walking down the Jewish street of the interwar years, and you look down the street, you don't see the Holocaust. You see some people looking up, but you don't actually know what they're looking up at until you turn the corner. And when you turn the corner, you see that they're looking up bombs being dropped on the city of Warsaw. It's September 1st, it's 1939, the Germans have invaded Poland. It is the beginning of World War II from a European perspective, because remember, the Americans don't enter World War II until the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So this is, from a European perspective, it is the beginning of World War II. And what's very important is that nobody, well, first of all, in Poland, until 6 weeks to 2 months before the invasion, nobody believed the Germans would invade Poland. And they didn't believe that if they did invade, that the Germans would win. And so all of this came as a surprise and as a shock, especially to the general population. Now, we do something rather unusual as museums go that deal with these long histories and the Holocaust, and that is that we treat the rise of Hitler and the 1930s as part of the interwar years story. And when we come to the Holocaust, we focus specifically on what took place within the borders of occupied Poland, which means the borders of the Second Polish Republic. And we do so based on an extraordinary collection. And this is just to show you, and of course, we're a site-specific museum. We're standing on the site of the Warsaw Ghetto. And that purple area here shows you the area in which a third of the population of Warsaw was confined in less than 3% of the territory of the city, of this whole city. A third of the population was confined in this area. It was maybe the densest population area, more than 7 people per room, basically in terms of density. It was extraordinarily crowded and under the worst possible conditions. So we have an extraordinary collection that we work with, which is the Warsaw Ghetto Underground Archive, that was created and led by Emanuel Ringelblum, who created a diary in Yiddish and had a team of about 60 volunteers who, in secret and really risking their lives, recorded and collected everything that would reflect what was happening in the Warsaw Ghetto and beyond, from reports they were getting from couriers and from refugees that were arriving in the Warsaw Ghetto. And what we do is we narrate again in the first person and in real time. It was very important for us that our visitors experience what those who were in the Warsaw Ghetto were experiencing in real time without knowing what was going to happen next. And we do that from a double perspective. From Ringelblum, a labor Zionist writing in Yiddish, head of the Ringelblum Archive, and from Cherniaków, writing in Polish, who was the head of the Judenrat, the Jewish council, that the Germans set up to run the ghetto and carry out their orders. And they basically, what happened is that before the Great Deportation in the summer, rather in April and May of 1942, the Oinik Shabbos, that's what they called themselves, the team of the Underground Archive, were worried that they wouldn't survive, and they packed up the archive and they buried it. And those who did survive and did remain in the ghetto just before the outbreak of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in April of 1943, they buried the rest of the archive in milk cans. And it was only after the war that 3 members of the team that survived went out into that rubble. There are no streets, no street signs, and they were able to actually locate one of the caches that had been hidden. And then in the 50s, the second cache was retrieved, and there's, we believe, a third cache, and it was never retrieved. So we present the Holocaust from the perspective of what was happening in Poland, what was happening in the Warsaw Ghetto as a kind of pars pro toto, Polish-Jewish relations. And then we don't stop with that story, and we don't stop with what the world knew and how the world responded or didn't respond. We actually then come into the post-war period, and we bring the story all the way up to the present. The big question that was asked during the post-war period by the 250,000 Jews that found themselves in Poland after the war was whether to stay or to leave. There were 3,300,000 Jews living in Poland in the Second Polish Republic in 1939, and 90% of them were murdered. And most of those who survived in the Soviet Union. They were saved by deportation. And a certain number of them came back. About 25,000 survived in hiding in Poland. That was not a way to survive. About 25,000 survived and came back from the camps. And altogether, there were about 250,000 Jews in Poland after the war. And over the course of the post-war period, most of them left. And we present that story here, the story of course, the Warsaw Ghetto Monument, and the story of staying, and of course, the story of leaving, particularly in the face of post-war violence. July 4th, 1946, the Kielce pogrom, of course, is the iconic event, but it was not the only event in this very violent 2-year period, particularly because right after the war, it was a very unsettled period, and the country was not fully demilitarized. There was hooliganism, homelessness, displacement. It was a very chaotic period, and it was a period of really extraordinary violence against Jews and a kind of emigration panic. And so we look at Jewish life under communism, but we also look at the exodus of Jews from Poland, so that by 1968, there are now only about 20,000 Jews left in Poland. 250,000 right after the war, 3,300,000 before the war, 20,000 in 1968. And as a result of the anti-Semitic government, communist government sponsored campaign, about 13,000 leave, and now there are maybe 6,000 left. And there is the feeling that the story is over, that the book is closed, that this is the last chapter, and that these the Jews who left under the most humiliating of conditions. We just commemorated the 50th anniversary of March 1968 in 2018. However, even under communism, in the last years, there was the beginnings of a renewal of Jewish life in Poland. And that's the story that we tell in the period after the fall of communism in 1989. And that is a story of the renewal of Jewish life on a small scale, and also the enormous presence of Jews in Polish consciousness. What we like to call small numbers, big presence, meaning that the relative and absolute number of Jews in Poland today is small, but that Jewish presence in Polish consciousness is huge. And this can be seen in, of course, the Krakow Jewish Culture Festival, and it can be seen in many, many other manifestations. And so with that, I would like to conclude, and I'm hoping, and I'll stop sharing, I am hoping that we might just have some questions. And I don't see anything in the chat, but I don't see anything in the chat. So if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. And I think you could probably unmute and show your video if you would like to ask them directly. I'm going to wait for that. Sorry?
Thank you for the wonderful lecture. I've been to the Pauline Museum, I think the last time a few years ago, and I would have thought it's impossible to give the kind of overview that you just gave in 1 hour. It's phenomenal. I always tell people who are going there to plan for at least a week and just to scratch the surface of this phenomenal collection. Not only is the collection phenomenal, but the way that it's presented, the curatorship of it is just unique, and it has deserved all of the recognition and the prizes that.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you.
So let me just ask our team here if there are any questions on various matters that you have. Yes, Alina, you have one.
So there's a question whether the museum offers.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
I will say it out loud in a moment. Yes. Does the museum offer
online guided
from
a docent?
Does the museum offer online guided tours offered by qualified people?
Okay, so I would say this, that we are in touch with really great tour guides that offer a variety of tours of Jewish Warsaw, whether they're Holocaust or they're pre-war, or there's a whole range of them. And there's some wonderful, really, really, really good tour guides for visiting Jewish Warsaw, and also, of course, for Krakow. And we can easily help anybody who's visiting Poland to find terrific guides. In addition, we do our own guided tours that are linked or related to our current exhibitions. So we just did one on the neighborhood where we're located, Miranów, and of course we did our own very special guided tours that were a way of connecting the neighborhood that we are in with the exhibition about that neighborhood in the museum. But in addition, we have online, a whole range of online tours, some of them about the core exhibition, some of them about specific aspects or areas of the core exhibition. Some of them are of the temporary exhibitions also.
Okay, I have a question for you, Barbara, but let me find out first if there are any other questions online.
Also, don't worry, I know what questions you should be asking, so I'm willing to ask them.
I have, well, let's find out if there's a question online, and then I have a burning question to ask you. Go ahead.
Okay, there is a question whether there are online versions of the map she showed from the museum.
Are there online versions of maps that you just showed us that exist?
I would say No, let me put it this way. Some of the images that I showed are online, but if you're interested in maps, that's another story. And I can, it wouldn't be difficult. I mean, I need to know more about what you're after, and I could easily send links to the relevant maps.
Okay, in that case, I will ask you my question, and you can tell me if this is one of the questions that I should be asking or not. Of course, the last few years I've been reading a lot about official government policy, which in fact even criminalizes, as far as I understand, in implication historical work which connects Polish people and Poland per se with the Holocaust, as opposed to Nazi occupiers of Poland. But I'm reading this in press in the West, and I don't know to what extent this is true. Can you comment on this? Would you like to comment on this?
Sure. So let me be clear about the issues. The first issue is an area of great sensitivity, and I think legitimately in Poland, and that is the equation of Germans and of the German state and the Polish state, and the German, quote, nation and the Polish nation as co-responsible for the genocide. So I want to be clear that that is the first area of sensitivity, and it is a legitimate concern. The genocide, the Holocaust proper, was a German project, period. There was no Polish state as such. During the Second World War, Poland was occupied by Germany and the Soviet Union. There was an underground state and there was a government in exile, but Poland itself was occupied, and the underground state and the government in exile were absolutely opposed to the occupation and were planning the uprising from a very early stage in an effort to overthrow the German occupiers. So that has to be very clearly understood, so that the language that bothers people in Poland, which you could say is oversensitive but understandable, is a language like the Polish death camps. So we know, and I think it's a problem that non-English speakers have that don't understand English, that Japanese internment camps in America doesn't mean that the Japanese who were interned made the camps. Or even Jan Karski referred to Jewish ghettos or Jewish concentration camps. In other words, it's a shorthand, and we know what it refers to. We know that it means concentration camps or death camps in Poland for Jews. So they're referred to as Jewish camps, Polish camps, German camp, but we all know what we're talking about. But from a Polish perspective, to call them Polish death camps, when they hear it, and they hear it in English, which is not generally their native language, they hear it as Poles created those camps. So that is like an example of what is for them very, 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 very sensitive. So that's the first thing. The second thing has to do with I would say, and here there's a concern with treating the Polish state and the Polish nation as co-responsible. That's their problem. They would accept that there were individual Poles that did terrible things. They were bad Poles. There were some bad actors, and they killed Jews, they blackmailed them, they turned them in, they robbed them, they did all kinds of terrible things. The area of disagreement is the extent of it. So the current right-wing government would like to present this as a few bad apples, and the Holocaust historians, these really brave and really good Holocaust historians in Poland and abroad, but especially in Poland, want to treat it as systemic. They want to say that not only systemic, but rather, systemic is maybe not the right word. They want to treat it as wider, deeper, and more brutal than the official historical policy would have it. So current right-wing government ran on a platform of down with the pedagogy of shame, up from our knees. We need to promote Polish pride and patriotism, that we acknowledge that everywhere there are always a few bad actors, a few bad apples, and all of this other Yadvabna and these other studies of violence, especially in the areas that had been occupied by the Soviets. I mean, it's a very particular story. The Soviet areas, the areas occupied by the Soviets, because there was a deal between the Germans and the Soviets to divide up the territory. And then the Germans broke the deal and pushed the Soviets out. And when they did that, the way the Holocaust unfolds in that area is actually quite different from the way that it unfolded within the first area occupied by the Germans, the general government, the General Gouvernement. So in that sort of, I would say, post-Soviet occupied territory, the violence was really much worse, broader, deeper, widespread than had been acknowledged. And it was Jan Gross's book in Neighbors, and then Fear, which is the post-war story, and the book on Treblinka, and the work, of course, of Barbara Engelking and Jan Grabowski. They have really been fearless in gathering the evidence to really confront the extent of this violence, and also to do so in a way that's very nuanced and very, I would say, very, very thoughtful. But it's really difficult for the current government and their current historical policy, which is to defend the good name of Poland. It's really, really difficult for them to accept and confront that story. So that's basically what's going on.
Okay, let me find out if there are any other questions, and if not, I have a closing question for you. Do we have any other questions online?
So there's a question to put like links in for these online.
Okay, there's a request to put links online to the museum and to the various online resources.
Sure. I'm gonna. What I'll do is I'll put. It's basically, if you go to pauline.pl, that's essentially the museum's website, and they have an English version of it. You just type English for the language.
Wonderful.
And if you let Alan or Craig know what links you would like, I'll prepare a little document.
Great, we will. So my last question to you, which I know could require a very long answer, but maybe you can just tell us briefly, since we're sort of at the end. I'm aware of the initiative of Chabad in Poland and so forth, but of course here at Yiddish Summer Weimar, one of the things that we look back to is this great flowering of secular Jewish culture, secular Yiddish culture that you mentioned in the interwar period. Do you see a return of a secular Jewish culture in Poland?
It's a very interesting situation. I mean, basically, the renewal of Jewish life, when it was developing under communism, a very big part of it, I would say that these young people in their 20s and 30s, they could not go to their parents for knowledge, because their parents, if their parents had decided to stay in Poland, in many instances they were communists, and they were very Polish and very wedded to Polish language and culture, and very remote from anything Jewish. So they didn't raise their kids Jewish, and when these kids either always knew they were at least legally or technically Jewish, but they had no content. It had virtually no content. Some of them did. I mean, I would say that that's not across the board. I mean, Helena Datner would be one that grew up with parents that definitely knew they were Jewish, and she knew she was Jewish, and there was a lot of Jewish content there. But say Stanislav Krajewski, I mean, his family were like communists to the bone, and there was nothing Jewish happening. So when they tried to figure out what it meant to be Jewish, they actually took the Jewish catalog, and they looked to their American Jewish peers. They wanted to be Jewish in a modern way. They did not want, they had no nostalgia. There was no nostalgia. And there was no kind of, we're going to be shtetl Jews. We're going to bring back the shtetl. we're going to be fiddler. No, not at all. They wanted to be contemporary, and this was, really, this would have been after 68. So it would be the 70s and 80s. So you can get a feel that it's still this very sort of 60s kind of vibe. And it was definitely the Jewish catalog. And I think that what they wanted to do was, and they created something called the Flying University, which was to create a kind of Jewish literacy. And what was most accessible to them was, I would say, religion in a very contemporary vein. So a contemporary key. It was a very contemporary and very flexible approach to what it meant to sort of I would say what it meant to be Jewish and to engage with Judaism. So it wasn't about creating an Orthodox synagogue or a Reform or a conservative, whatever. If anything, the Havurah movement, I think, would have been more, or Reconstructionist would have probably been more. But then more and more and more, a number of them went in the direction of Orthodoxy, not Chabad, but Orthodoxy. Whether it was in the Nozick synagogue, which was more so, or it was in the so-called progressive, which I think of as kind of conservadox, but in any event. So, but at the same time, there was a lot of interest in Jewish culture. And interestingly, non-Jews played an exceptionally important role in, I would say, in fostering, cultivating, incubating Jewish culture. And of course, I'm thinking of the Jewish Culture Festival and Janusz. So, and I think that the emergence of the klezmer revival in the 70s was a very, very, very big element. So you're getting all of it happening, and you're getting it as a kind of collaboration between Jews and non-Jews, as culture makers, as musicians, as producers, as presenters. You're getting a whole spectrum. Now, interestingly, Chabad arrives very late, because Chabad loves a vacuum, and there was no vacuum. So it wasn't as if there was nothing happening and Chabad would step in and be the rainmaker. So in fact, Chabad has arrived relatively late, and it's not it is as yet not a very strong movement. Right now there is the Nozick Synagogue, there is Eitz Chaim, which is progressive but more in the conservadox orientation. And then there are the sort of Beit Polska, Beit Warszawa, which are more, I would say, progressive in a looser kind of guitar strumming direction. If you
like that.
And also very, very welcoming of people without asking them if they're, quote, Jewish, but like very, very welcoming and very open and very accessible and very, it's a different thing. So you've got all of that. And I think you've even got some variations on it, but you've got a JCC and a Hillel, and you've got B'nai B'rith, and you have the American Jewish Committee, and you have, umpteen organizations of one and various kinds. So it's really, like a lot of organizations, almost more organizations than there are Jews, but that's not.
All right, Barbara, I want to thank you for giving us your time so generously and your knowledge. And I'm just telling you that I'm looking forward to the day that you'll spend a week with us here, or longer than a week.
I would love it.
We've been trying to make that happen a long time, and it's a big fond wish of mine that dream will come true sometime. So
I will love it. Listen, Ellen, we've been trying for years, and so as soon as I can.
And let us know when you're in Europe anyway. If you're in Europe and you're anywhere near here, maybe we would set up some lectures anyway, just for you to come by here, Yiddish summer or no Yiddish summer. And Yiddish summer needs you. So we hope to see you.
Thank you. So listen, I wish you all every success, and let this summer, under these very extraordinary conditions, be a success in its own way too. And thank you very, very much for including me.
Thank you. And also, as a final word, thanks again to Craig Riedelman for helping make all of this happen. Have a good day.
Okay, you too.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Greg, are you still on?